Meet Christopher Lane, a quietly driven CEO in Denver's booming organic foods world. Once full of life, he's become a recluse, haunted by the tragic loss of his fiancée Lydia 9 years ago. On a Sunday morning, Christopher's routine commute is upended when he stops at a humble lemonade stand run by a bright-eyed 9-year-old girl. Her polite, "Good morning, sir," is the first warm greeting Christopher has felt in years. As the girl tilts her head to pour, Christopher freezes. There, just behind her ear, is the unmistakable birthmark he knew only on Lydia. His heart races. He asks her name. "I'm Hope. Mama says I'm a miracle," she replies sweetly. Every ounce of Christopher's carefully contained grief surges to the surface. Hope's name mirrors the one Lydia dreamed of for their own daughter. Driven by a mix of shock and longing, Christopher trails Hope back to her rundown apartment, where he discovers her mother Grace, Lydia's sister, gravely ill. A devastating secret emerges. Hope is Christopher and Lydia's child, conceived just before Lydia's accident. Overwhelmed, Christopher must decide whether to reclaim the family he thought he'd lost or remain imprisoned by guilt. What will Christopher risk to bridge 9 years of absence? Can a father's love heal past wounds? Dive into this gripping tale of unexpected reunion, heartbreaking stakes, and a promise of new beginnings. Hit subscribe now to join us for every heartfelt twist and turn in Christopher and Hope's journey. Christopher Lane's world had grown achingly small. At 54, he presided over Greensprout Organics, Denver's fastest-growing farm-to-table empire. And yet, each morning he awoke in a penthouse that felt more like a gilded cage. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Rocky Mountains beyond, but to Christopher they looked like distant sentinels, untouchable, indifferent. For 9 years, since the accident that took Lydia's life, he'd lived in an emotional fog. Board meetings, quarterly projections, product launches, each one a ritual he performed robotically, as if reciting someone else's script. He slipped into his bespoke charcoal suit, smoothing the lapels with deliberate care. The clothes still fit perfectly, but he no longer felt at home in them. In the mirror's reflection, his salt and pepper hair was impeccably styled, his jaw clean-shaven, but his eyes, once bright with ambition, now looked haunted. He paused before the mirror, as though searching for the man he used to be. Where had that man gone? Downstairs, his assistant Mia knocked softly on the door. "Christopher, you have an early meeting with the board at 8. They're expecting your presentation on the new urban vertical farm pilot." Her voice held gentle concern, as it always did. Mia had been with him since the days before Greensprout became a household name. She'd seen him at his most driven and at his most broken. "Thanks, Mia," he murmured, mustering a thin smile. "I'm on my way." She nodded, offering a warm, understanding look before slipping out. Christopher exhaled, steeling himself for another day of transactions and negotiations, but every carefully rehearsed sentence felt hollow on his tongue. He took the glass elevator down to the lobby, where polished marble floors reflected his image back at him, a titan of industry who'd lost the person who made his success feel worthwhile. In the valet area, he paused long enough to notice the family photos Mia had placed at the reception desk. Smiling couples holding infants, siblings bundled in park autumn leaves. He glanced away, unwilling to let the reminders pierce the armor he'd worn since Lydia's death. His black BMW X5 waited, engine already purring. Christopher slipped behind the wheel, his seat adjusted just so, the same position he'd taken for countless drives through Denver's tree-lined streets. Before he could engage the drive, a message pinged on his dashboard screen. "Board meeting in 15 minutes. He tapped the confirmation, but the words blurred. Lydia's favorite morning ritual had been far simpler than any business calendar. A walk through Cheeseman Park, hand in hand, arms linked, watching the geese on the lake. She'd been a nurse, devoted to helping others. He'd been the man who sought control, and, inevitably, success at any cost. Their worlds had collided with a spark that neither could have planned, and for a brief, incandescent moment, they'd been perfect together. Then came the accident. A bend in Clear Creek Canyon, a twist of metal, Lydia's name on his lips as he fought to reach her. By the time he arrived, she was already gone, her life extinguished in a single, brutal instant. Christopher's grief had consumed him. He threw himself into work as though erasing her absence with each new contract signed, but the void only deepened, until he realized that no amount of corporate conquest could fill the space she'd left behind. He sighed as he merged onto Interstate 25, the downtown skyline rising before him. The boardroom on the 42nd floor would demand his attention. Figures, forecasts, growth projections. He reveled in the clarity of numbers, but hated the way they reminded him how thoroughly everything else had slipped from his grasp. At a red light, he glanced at the rearview mirror. For a moment, he expected to see Lydia's warm brown eyes behind him, her hair tousled from the wind in his convertible. Instead, he saw only the cold reflection of headlights stretching down the highway. He closed his eyes briefly, wishing time could rewind, wishing he could trade his executive title for a single ordinary morning with her. When the light turned green, he drove on, past the corporate towers, past the empty luxury condos, past the echo of his own footsteps in grand hallways. He would stand before the board soon enough, his voice steady, his vision clear. He would lead them confidently toward the next great initiative for Greensprout. But afterward, after the applause died and the last slide faded to black, he would return to this same penthouse, to the same hollow ache that no achievement could soothe. And so he pressed on, driven by a mandate older and deeper than any business plan, the quiet hope, buried beneath his resentment and his regret, that somewhere beyond the spreadsheets and the boardroom debates, he might one day rediscover the courage to love and to live again. But for now, the road ahead was littered with ghosts, and Christopher Lane, CEO of a thriving organic empire, was still learning how to navigate them. The following Sunday dawned crisp and clear, a welcome reprieve from Denver's usual bustle. Christopher Lane awoke before dawn, the memory of red lights and empty boardrooms still heavy in his chest. Today, though, he decided to take a different route, down residential streets lined with blossoming cherry trees instead of glass towers reflecting impersonal ambition. He slipped into jeans and a soft gray sweater, foregoing his usual tailored stiffness for something more casual, something that might remind him what it felt like to be simple. By mid-morning, the city hummed with life. Joggers traced the sidewalks, cyclists weaved lazily through traffic, and in the distance, a church bell tolled softly. Christopher piloted his car down Elm Street, the maple leaves rustling through his open window. As he rounded a corner, he spotted a small folding table adorned with a bright yellow tablecloth and hand-lettered signs reading "Lemonade, $2," and "Enjoy a Sweet Moment." Beneath the canopy, a girl of about 9 stood with practiced poise, her light brown hair pulled into a neat ponytail. 2 pastel buckets, one for lemonade, one for tips, rested at her feet, and stacked beside her were plastic cups gleaming in the sun. Something about her presence, so earnest, so unguarded, made Christopher's breath hitch. He eased the car to a gentle stop at the curb, heart thudding oddly in his chest. It had been years since anyone greeted him with such unself-conscious hope. The girl noticed him immediately. Her gray eyes, clear as storm cloud skies, lit up with polite excitement. She straightened, her small hand reaching for a cup. "Good morning, sir. Would you like some lemonade?" she asked, her voice bright yet respectful, as if she knew just how precious each polite word could be in a world that often overlooked children. Christopher lifted his chin, managing a gentle smile that surprised even him. Yes, please," he replied quietly, rolling down the window the rest of the way. $2? She nodded eagerly, picking up a cup and filling it with ice. The translucent yellow liquid sloshed invitingly. "That'll be $2, please." He reached into his wallet, withdrew a crisp bill, and handed it to her. "Thank you." He took the cup, raised it halfway to his lips, then paused. "What's your name?" "Hope," she answered instantly, eyes bright. "My name's Hope Summers," she added shyly. "Mom says I'm her miracle." Christopher felt his throat constrict. The word, miracle, echoed in his mind. Lydia's favorite word. The word she'd once used when she learned she was carrying their child. He cleared his throat softly. "Thank you, Hope." He brought the lemonade to his lips and sipped. Tart, sweet, ice-cold, a burst of sunshine in his mouth. He exhaled, savoring the simple flavor. For a moment, he tasted childhood again. Behind him, another car honked impatiently. Christopher offered the girl a small nod. "I'm late for a meeting, but this was worth the detour." Hope beamed proudly. "Glad you like it. Have a nice day, sir." She turned to wave, her ponytail bobbing. Christopher started his car and drove on, but not before he glanced back. The lemonade stand and that small, earnest face had imprinted itself on him. He clutched the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Busy as he was, boardroom deadlines and investor calls felt suddenly less urgent. Something about Hope's confidence, standing alone on a sidewalk, selling lemonade, flooded him with warmth he hadn't felt in years. The city came back into focus as he merged onto the main avenue. Yet, even as he drove away, Hope's words echoed in his mind. My miracle. His miracle? It felt both absurd and achingly possible. Christopher arrived at his office building 15 minutes late. Unheard of and yet somehow inevitable. His assistant Mia greeted him with a furrowed brow. "Christopher, you're late," she reminded him gently, concern lacing her tone. He gave a small, rueful shrug. "I'm sorry, Mia. I stopped for lemonade." He held out the nearly unwrung-out cup as proof. Mia's eyes widened, surprise dissolving into a soft smile. "Well, you look happier," she said, curiosity in her voice. "Tell me about this stand." He paused in the lobby, the memory of Hope's bright face and the taste of tart lemonade filling him with unexpected lightness. "There was a girl, 9 years old, named Hope," he began. "She sold the best lemonade I've ever had. She said her mom calls her a miracle." Mia's eyes grew misty, touched by something in his voice. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "Miracles do happen, Christopher." He nodded, swallowing hard. The elevator doors opened to the executive floor, but he hesitated. For the first time in years, he considered a different kind of meeting, one not tethered to profit margins or quarterly growth. He thought of Lydia's laughter when he tried to bake cookies for her, of the afternoons they spent planning a future that had vanished too soon. And he realized that perhaps the miracle she'd spoken of was still possible, even now, as he navigated grief and solitude. The boardroom lights glinted off polished mahogany as he took his seat, heart still buzzing with Hope's innocent zeal. As the meeting began, he spoke the keywords required: expansion, ROI, sustainability, but his mind wandered back to that small folding table on Elm Street. He resolved, almost unconsciously, that today's agenda would not be his only focus. In a world of spreadsheets and projections, Hope had reminded him of something far more vital: the sweetness of a simple moment and the power of a single child's faith. As Christopher Lane presented the numbers with newfound clarity, his gaze flickered to the window, where he imagined a brave little girl in a ponytail offering lemonade, and a reminder that life's most profound miracles often come in the smallest packages. The weeks following Christopher's chance encounter with Hope became a kaleidoscope of unexpected emotions. Each Sunday, he took the same winding street, first to the lemonade stand, then beyond, to catch glimpses of the bright-eyed girl who had unwittingly awakened something in him. But today felt different. As he rounded the familiar corner, his pulse quickened at the sight of 2 pastel buckets and a solitary folding table draped in yellow. Hope was there, but she wasn't alone. A smaller figure stood beside her, head bowed as she carefully poured lemonade from the pitcher. The girl was perhaps 6 years old, her dark hair cropped short into an uneven bob. Christopher's gaze followed patterns he knew all too well: the curve of her jaw, the slope of her nose, the delicate pink scar that ran behind her left ear. At first he thought it a trick of sunlight or a mistaken shadow, but then he saw it clearly. The identical birthmark, the small crescent moon shape exactly where Lydia's had rested. His breath caught so sharply that he nearly stalled the car. The world narrowed to the two children, their heads bent over cups of ice, and the ghost of memories long buried. He remembered Lydia's laughter when he teased her about that tiny mark, how she'd tilted her head and said, "You'll find it again someday, just waiting for me to notice." He'd brushed her off then, too consumed by boardroom battles to linger over a moment of tenderness, but he noticed it now, painfully keen. He parked hastily, almost recklessly, and approached the table. Hope looked up, her gray eyes as bright as ever, and smiled. "Hi, Mr. Christopher. Want some lemonade?" she chirped. Christopher cleared his throat, voice strangely distant. "Hope? Who is that with you?" Hope glanced at the younger girl. "This is my sister Lily," she said proudly. "We line up so the lemonade stays balanced," she explained emphatically, nudging Lily's shoulder. Lily straightened, smoothing an apron too big for her frame, then offered Christopher a cup with a shy nod. He accepted it, but didn't raise it to drink. Instead, he leaned closer, peering at the curve behind Lily's ear. His heart pounded so violently he feared Lily would notice. "Lily," he whispered, "may I see your ear?" Lily froze, eyes wide with cautious curiosity. Hope gasped, alarm flickering across her face. "No!" Hope protested urgently. "Mom says we don't show that mark to strangers." Her voice trembled with protective ferocity that both warmed and broke Christopher's heart. He knelt gently to their level, keeping his tone soft but earnest. "I understand," he said carefully, "but I need to ask because, did your mother ever talk about someone named Lydia?" The name tumbled out, heavy with unspoken longing. Lily's gaze darted to Hope's, and Hope hesitated as if torn between fear and truth. Finally, she swallowed audibly and said, "Mom says her name is Grace, but a long time ago, she talked about Aunt Lydia." "Aunt Lydia?" Christopher's pulse thundered. "And does Aunt Lydia have a mark behind her ear?" He exhaled shakily, as though summoning courage. "Exactly like Lily's." Lily's tiny face pinched with confusion. "I don't know," she murmured, voice tremulous. "Mom said Lydia was very special, but she's not my real aunt." At that confession, Christopher's pulse surged, his breath coming fast. May I please meet your mother?" he asked, voice cracking. "It's very important." Hope's gray eyes locked onto his. She studied him with astonishing intuitiveness for a child. "You're not the first stranger who wants to meet her," Hope said softly, almost too seriously. "Some people, they try to take her away." Her words hit him like a physical blow. "Take her away?" he repeated feebly. Hope nodded solemnly. "Mom says strangers are tricky. They don't know who we really are." She glanced at Lily, who now hugged Hope's side tightly. Christopher realized he had to tread carefully. He straightened slowly. "I promise I'm not here to take anyone away. I only want to understand." The city's hum receded behind him. Honking cars felt like distant echoes. He offered them a gentle, half-smile. "How about this?" he said, voice firming with determination. "May I buy all of your lemonade today, and maybe talk to your mother afterward?" He laid a $20 bill on the table. The amount was substantial for two kids selling pinky-price refreshment. Hope and Lily exchanged glances, one of proud triumph, the other of hesitant hope. "All of it?" Hope beamed. She poured lemonade into cup after cup, stacking them until Lily carefully counted dollars into the tip bucket. Christopher watched, his heart fluttering with a mixture of remorse and anticipation. When Hope handed him the last cup, he raised it in a quiet toast. "To new friends," he said gently. Hope's grin faltered only slightly at the adult word, friends. She tilted the cup toward him in imitation. "To friends." Lily offered a small nod, her eyes wide with guarded curiosity. Christopher scooped up Lily's hand and lowered his voice, careful not to alarm her. "I'm going to meet your mother now," he promised quietly. "I hope you'll let me talk with her for just a minute." Lily squeezed his fingers, then relented with a slow, cautious nod. Hope watched, her gaze steady and inscrutable. With a final sip of lemonade that tasted now like a mixture of hope and heartbreak, Christopher rose. The skyscrapers of Denver felt miles away as he followed Hope and Lily down Elm Street, back toward the modest row of townhouses that bore the weight of whispered secrets and untold truths. Each step carried the weight of his own past. The loss of Lydia, the emptiness that shadowed his life, and now the fragile hint of something he'd believed lost forever. Connection. The faint birthmark behind Lily's ear had unlocked a door he never thought he'd approach again. In the gentle autumn light, he realized that meeting Grace, this woman who guarded her daughters fiercely, would demand all his courage. But, for the sake of 3 extraordinary children, he was ready to find that courage at last. The townhouses on Elm Street were old, their paint dulled by time and weather, but they stood upright with a quiet dignity, like they were still trying to protect the families within, even as the world moved on. Christopher followed Hope and Lily at a respectful distance, his hands clenched in his coat pockets to keep them from shaking. He didn't know what kind of woman Grace would be, whether she would recognize him, hate him, or slam the door in his face. But he had to try. They reached the 3rd unit from the corner, where the screen door hung slightly off one hinge. Hope turned, her eyes searching his. "She doesn't like surprises," she said softly, as if she was protecting Grace and warning him at the same time. "She doesn't like being reminded." "Reminded of what?" Christopher asked gently. Hope looked down. "Of things that made her cry." His throat tightened. He nodded once, solemnly. "I won't hurt her," he promised. "I just want to talk." Hope exchanged a glance with Lily. Then, without another word, she slipped inside the house, leaving the door slightly ajar. Christopher stepped up onto the small porch, heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the sounds of the street behind him. A moment later, Hope reappeared. "She said you can come in, but only for a little." He stepped inside. The house was modest, clean despite its worn furniture and scuffed floors. The air smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. On the far side of the room, sitting upright in a recliner with a blanket over her legs, was a woman who looked far too young to be as tired as she appeared, Grace. Her hair, once thick and honey brown like Lydia's, was now thinner, tied back in a loose bun. Her skin was pale, but her eyes, those unmistakable gray eyes, were piercing as ever. She looked him over slowly, like she was examining not just the man in front of her, but every memory he carried with him. "You're late," she said. The words landed like a slap, but her voice wasn't angry, just resigned. Christopher swallowed hard. "You know who I am." Grace nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Of course I do. Lydia talked about you right until the day she slipped away." The room swayed slightly. Christopher moved to the edge of the coffee table, his knees too weak to stand. "Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because I watched what losing her did to you," Grace said quietly. "I saw the way you shut down. You weren't just grieving her, you were erasing her, disappearing into your work, your world of investors and polished speeches. You couldn't even speak at her memorial, Chris. You left after 15 minutes. I didn't know she was pregnant." "I know you didn't." Grace looked down, her hands folding together. "She didn't either, not until the hospital. Lydia was brain dead, but Hope was alive. She was a miracle, a heartbeat when we had none left. I had to choose. Christopher's voice cracked. You kept her alive? Alone? Grace nodded. She never got to hold her. But Lydia picked the name. She used to say, if I ever have a daughter, I'll name her Hope, because that's what she'll be. A tear slid down Christopher's cheek before he could stop it. I've missed so much. You missed everything, Grace replied, but her tone wasn't cruel, just brutally honest. Silence settled between them. Lily sat on the carpet, coloring. Hope stood by the window, arms crossed. I want to be in her life, Christopher finally said. I want to know her, know them. Grace met his gaze. You can't just drop in, Chris. You're not Santa Claus. You don't get to show up once and vanish again. I don't plan to vanish. She's not a charity case. She doesn't need your guilt. She needs consistency, stability. He nodded slowly. Then I'll show up. I'll come every week, every day if I can. Grace leaned back in the recliner, her eyes never leaving him. She doesn't know who you are. I know. She thinks you're a kind man who likes lemonade and told her she's brave. Christopher's voice broke. That's who I want to be. At least, until she's ready for the rest. There was another long pause. Then Grace gestured toward the hallway. Her room's the second door on the left. If you really want to know her, start there. Help her with her drawing. It's what she does when she misses Lydia. Christopher rose slowly. As he reached the doorway, Grace spoke again, softer this time. You broke my sister's heart, Chris, but you can still choose not to break our daughter's. He nodded, his throat too tight to answer. Then he walked down the hall, toward a room filled with child-sized dreams and a little girl named Hope, who had no idea just how much she had already changed his life. The room smelled like crayons and fabric softener. Soft afternoon light spilled through faded curtains, casting gentle shadows across the lavender walls. On the small bed in the corner sat Hope, legs crisscrossed, her head bent over a large sketch pad. Her tongue poked slightly from the corner of her mouth as she colored in a thick red heart. Next to it, drawn in blocky, earnest lines, were 3 figures, 2 women and a little girl holding both their hands. Christopher stood at the doorway, unsure if he should speak. The sight of her, so focused, so absorbed in her own small world, caught something in his chest and refused to let go. Hope looked up. Her eyes widened, but she didn't seem scared. Just curious. Mr. Lemonade, she said, tilting her head, a faint smile playing at her lips. He smiled back, stepping into the room slowly. I guess that's going to be my nickname now. She shrugged, playfully. You drank the whole cup. Most grown-ups don't. I think it was the best lemonade I've had in my entire life. Hope beamed with pride. I use extra honey. That's the secret. He lowered himself onto the floor, careful not to disturb the pages scattered around her. Can I see what you're drawing? She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the red crayon. Then, slowly, she turned the pad toward him. This is me, she explained, pointing to the smallest figure. That's my mom, and that's Aunt Grace. Sometimes I pretend we all still live together in a house with flowers. Christopher studied the drawing, his throat tight. You're very good. She shrugged again, more bashful this time. Mom taught me how to draw flowers before she went to the sky. He nodded, emotion thick in his chest. Do you remember her well? Hope's voice dropped to a whisper. Only in dreams, and stories Aunt Grace tells. Sometimes I think I remember her. Laugh, but I don't know if it's real or just something I made up. Christopher gently picked up another page. This one was a castle with 3 stick figures at the top. And who's this? That's my dream family, she said quietly. A mom, a dad, and a daughter, like in fairy tales. He didn't speak. Couldn't. Hope suddenly looked up at him, her amber eyes wide. Were you my mom's friend? Christopher inhaled sharply. The question, so innocent and yet so loaded, caught him completely off guard. I was, he said carefully. "A long time ago." She nodded, as if satisfied with the answer. "She must have liked you. I think people know who's kind and who's fake. That's what Grace says. Grace is very wise." Hope twirled a strand of hair around her finger. "Sometimes I draw my dad, too, but I don't really know what he looks like. Grace said he loved my mom a lot, but he was really sad when she died and didn't know about me. That's okay, right?" Christopher blinked, fighting the tears building in his eyes. "Yeah," he said hoarsely. "Sometimes grown-ups mess up, but it doesn't mean they don't care." She studied him a long moment, then leaned over and picked up a clean sheet. "Want to draw something with me?" He hesitated, then took the blue crayon she handed him. "Sure. What should we draw?" Hope thought for a second. "A garden. A big one, with sunflowers and butterflies. Mom said she wanted to plant one someday." Together they filled the page, Christopher's unsteady hand trailing behind her confident strokes. She giggled when he gave one of the butterflies sunglasses. For a few minutes there was nothing but laughter and colors. No heavy truths, no painful memories. Just a little girl and a man trying to catch up on a decade of absence through a picture of flowers. When Grace's soft knock came at the door, neither of them heard it right away. She peeked in and paused, watching the scene before her with unreadable eyes. Hope turned excitedly. "Grace! Look, Mr. Lemonade made a sunflower with a hat." Grace nodded, her gaze flicking briefly to Christopher. "That's very creative. We're going to hang it up next to Mom's picture," Hope added, hopping off the bed. Grace's smile was tight. "That's a lovely idea, but it's getting late. You should start your homework, Sweet Pea." Hope obeyed without protest, carrying her art proudly. As she disappeared into the hallway, Grace stepped in and shut the door behind her. "She likes you," she said quietly. Christopher rose from the floor, brushing his hands on his slacks. "She's extraordinary. She's also sensitive and smart. She'll figure it out soon enough." He nodded slowly. "I know." Grace looked at him hard. "If you're planning to vanish again, do it now. Don't wait until she calls you Dad in her sleep." "I'm not going anywhere," he replied, his voice low but steady. Grace's expression softened. Just a little. "Then get ready, Chris, because if you're going to be part of her life, it's going to change yours forever." The kitchen smelled faintly of mint tea and toasted bread, though neither masked the weight hanging in the air. Christopher sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug more for comfort than warmth. Across from him, Grace stirred her tea with deliberate slowness, the metal spoon clinking against porcelain like a quiet metronome counting down to something neither wanted to say. "She doesn't know," Grace finally said, her voice even, but heavy. "Not really. Not yet." Christopher nodded slowly. "But she's asking." Grace exhaled, eyes trained on the steam rising from her mug. "She's always asking. About her mom, about why I'm the one raising her, about why she doesn't have a dad like the other kids at school." Her voice caught just slightly. "I've always told her what I could, that her mother loved her more than anything, that she came into this world surrounded by love, that she was a miracle." Christopher looked down, his throat tightening. "You've done a remarkable job, Grace. I can see that in every word she speaks, every smile, but she deserves to know." Grace met his eyes, and for a moment, all the years of tension and sacrifice pressed between them. "Deserve is a complicated word, Chris. I've spent every day for the last 9 years trying to protect that girl from pain, from the truth. I didn't lie, but I didn't go looking for the man who left her mother alone either." "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "You have to believe me. If I had—" "You would have what?" Grace interrupted, though not harshly. "Just weary. Dropped your empire for a daughter you didn't know existed? Left the boardroom for a bottle warmer? You were a wreck after Lydia died. You vanished. We buried her without you." "I couldn't breathe without her," Christopher whispered. "I blamed myself. I still do." Silence stretched between them, pierced only by the distant sound of Hope's humming in the next room, like the thread that kept everything from unraveling. "I wasn't trying to punish you," Grace finally said, her tone softening. "But I didn't think you were ready, and then you never came back." "I didn't think there was anything to come back to," he admitted bitterly. "Until I saw her at that lemonade stand. Until she smiled at me with Lydia's eyes and broke open everything I thought was buried." Grace studied him for a long moment. "She needs stability, Chris. Not a visitor who drops in and out. If you're in this, you need to be all the way in. Not just emotionally, legally, logistically, everything." Christopher nodded. "I want to be. I don't even know how yet, but I want to try." Grace leaned back, folding her arms. "Then start with something small. Tomorrow's Sunday. We go to the park after lunch. Come with us. Let her lead the way. Don't push. Don't promise anything you're not ready to keep." He managed a small smile. "Got it. Let her be the boss." "Exactly," Grace said with a wry look. "Welcome to parenting." Sunday afternoon brought sunshine and the crisp scent of fresh-cut grass. The park near their apartment was modest. Worn benches, a tired jungle gym, but filled with energy. Laughter bounced between trees. Children ran wild with sticky fingers and grass-stained knees. Christopher stood beside Grace near the entrance, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, nervously scanning the crowd. Hope was already tugging him toward the swings, excitement radiating from her every bounce. "Push me!" she called, beaming over her shoulder. "Your wish is my command," he said, catching the swing and giving it a gentle push. As she soared higher, her giggles filled the air. Her hair caught the sun, just like Lydia's used to. Christopher felt the world narrow to that moment, just her laughter and the steady rhythm of the swing. "Higher!" she squealed. "I don't know," he teased. "Any higher and you might reach the moon." She looked back at him with wide, earnest eyes. "Would you come get me if I did?" The question struck him with such emotional clarity he nearly stumbled. "Every time," he said, his voice low but fierce. "Every single time." They moved through the park after that. Slides, monkey bars, a brief detour to a hot dog stand where Hope insisted he get extra mustard even though she made a face when he bit into it. At one point she sat beside him on a sun-warmed bench, her legs swinging. "Can I ask you something?" she said, not looking at him. "Of course." "Do you think my mom would be proud of me?" Christopher's breath caught. He turned to face her. "Hope, your mom would be so proud of you it would knock the stars out of the sky. You're everything she dreamed of." Hope smiled shyly, then looked down at her hands. "Do you miss her?" she asked. "Every day," he said without hesitation. "Every breath." She nodded like she understood more than she should. "Me too." Christopher reached out, unsure, but she leaned into him first, her small frame tucked neatly under his arm. They sat that way for a long time, the world moving quietly around them, as if honoring the unspoken bond forming between them. Christopher had never been good at waiting. Boardrooms, deals, travel delays, he'd always found a way to control the pace, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the quiet ache of wondering what a child thought of him after a park visit. The next morning, he stared at his phone far longer than necessary, wondering if it was too soon to call Grace. He didn't want to crowd them. And yet, when the text arrived, "Hope says she made something for you. Are you free for dinner?" He exhaled, as though he'd been holding his breath all day. That evening, he stood outside their apartment with a small bouquet of wildflowers and a tin of lemon shortbread cookies, the only dessert he knew how to bake from his college days. It was a clumsy offering, but it made Hope's eyes light up as she opened the door. "You brought flowers for Mommy," she said, delighted. "And cookies. Are they for me or for all of us?" "All of us," Christopher chuckled. "But I might need someone to test them first. Quality control." She grinned and beckoned him inside. Grace looked better today, tired, but stronger. She was wearing a soft flannel shirt and leaning against the counter as dinner simmered on the stove. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said with a faint smile. "It's the least I could do," Christopher replied gently. "Besides, Hope told me she had something for me. I came prepared." Hope practically skipped to the corner and returned with a sheet of construction paper. "Ta-da!" He unfolded it carefully. Crayon-drawn figures, 3 of them. A tall man with glasses, a woman with curly hair, and a little girl in between holding both their hands. Above the scene, in bright, shaky letters, were the words, "My family." Christopher's throat tightened as he blinked back emotion. "This is beautiful, Hope. Is that me?" "Uh-huh," she said proudly. "You're wearing a tie, like the one from yesterday. And who's the beautiful lady next to you?" "Mommy." "Of course." Grace's expression froze just a moment. Then she turned away to stir the pot on the stove. Christopher crouched beside Hope. "Thank you for this. I'm going to keep it forever." "You're welcome," she whispered shyly. "I'm glad you came back." Later, after dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, simple but warm, Hope asked if he'd help her with a school project. They sat together at the kitchen table, the assignment a family tree. "Do you want to include Lydia?" Christopher asked cautiously. Hope looked up, curious. "Why would I?" Christopher glanced at Grace for help, but she remained quiet. He hesitated. "Just wondering." "I'll put Auntie Grace," Hope decided, tapping the top branch. "And you." "Are you sure?" Hope gave him a serious look. "You're part of my life now, right?" Christopher smiled, his voice tender. "I hope so." Grace watched from across the room, her fingers curled around a mug. It was a quiet moment, but it filled the space with something new, trust, hesitant, but blooming. The next afternoon, Hope's laughter echoed off the walls of Christopher's penthouse. He'd brought her over after school to see where he lived, and she marveled at everything, from the elevator to the automatic blinds. "This place is huge," she gasped, running from room to room. "You could fit our whole building in here." He laughed, following her through the hallway. "It's a little much, I know. But it's quiet," she added, pausing in the kitchen. "You live here all alone?" "Yes." "Don't you get lonely?" Christopher opened his mouth but found no quick answer. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but not today." She smiled and twirled once before hopping onto a bar stool. "Can I have apple juice?" "Coming right up, Miss Hope." He poured the drink and watched her from across the counter, still stunned by how naturally she'd settled into his world. "Do you think," she said suddenly, "if I'd been born earlier, Mommy would still be alive?" The question hit him like a gust of wind on an icy day, unexpected, cutting, and impossible to deflect. "Sweetheart," he said gently, kneeling beside her, "your mommy loved you more than anything. She held on as long as she could. You being here, that's her miracle, not a reason for anything bad." Hope nodded slowly, but her eyes shimmered. "Auntie Grace says Mommy used to hum when she was happy. I hum too." "She would have loved that," Christopher whispered, "and she'd be proud of how brave you are." Hope leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. "I like you. I like you too, even though you didn't know me, especially because I know you now." As evening settled, Hope lay curled on the couch beneath one of his cashmere throws, half asleep as a nature documentary played in the background. Grace stepped into the penthouse quietly. She'd come to pick her up, but stood in the doorway, watching. "She's comfortable here," she murmured. "She's home here," Christopher replied, more to himself than to Grace. Grace looked at him, serious now. "We need to talk about next steps. If you're going to be in her life like this, it can't just be informal anymore." He met her gaze, heart pounding. "I was hoping you'd say that." The next morning dawned gray and restless, but Christopher was already awake before the sun rose, pacing across his penthouse floor in socks, coffee gone cold in his hand. Grace's words from the night before echoed in his mind. "We need to talk about next steps." It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation, a fragile bridge between the man he used to be and the man Hope needed him to become. At 9:00 a.m., sharp, he walked into the downtown office of Rachel Wynne, a family law attorney with a reputation for turning complicated stories into hopeful resolutions. She was sharp-eyed, calm-voiced, and unflinchingly honest. "So, you're saying you only recently learned about your daughter?" Rachel asked as she flipped through the file he'd handed her. "Yes," Christopher replied. "Lydia and she passed before she could tell me. Grace raised Hope. I want to be in her life, permanently, legally." Rachel nodded slowly, then looked up. "And Grace supports that?" He nodded. "She does. But there's a complication." "There always is," she said dryly. "Tell me." He exhaled. "Grace's cousin, Eric, filed for emergency guardianship after Grace was hospitalized. Claims I'm a stranger with no standing. Technically, he's not wrong. On paper, I don't exist in Hope's world." Rachel leaned back in her chair. "We'll change that." Meanwhile, in a sunlit apartment across the city, Grace sat on the edge of her bed, thin arms wrapped around herself. Hope sat nearby, silently coloring. "Sweetheart," Grace said gently, "if Mommy gets sicker, I need you to know that you'll still be safe. Christopher, he's a good man. He wants to be there for you." Hope paused mid-color. "Will he still come even if I'm sad sometimes?" Grace swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "Yes, especially then." Later that week, Christopher stood outside the family court building, his tie knotted tighter than usual. Grace, wrapped in a beige shawl, waited beside him, frail but firm. "This is going to be hard," she said quietly. "Eric isn't coming out of concern. It's about pride, power." Christopher looked at her. "Then let's fight for something real." Inside the courtroom, Eric Reeves was all polished arrogance, suit tailored, voice smooth. "Your Honor," he began, "Ms. Bennett's condition renders her unfit for long-term guardianship. I've stepped in during her illness. I've known Hope her whole life. This man didn't even know she existed until recently." Rachel stood calmly, unfazed. "Your Honor, we do not dispute Mr. Reeves's timeline. We assert that the timeline was built on a false foundation. Mr. Lane was kept from the truth due to a tragic series of events. His relationship with the child is blossoming. Grace Bennett herself supports this transition." The judge, a silver-haired woman with tired eyes, tapped her pen thoughtfully. "Do you have any documentation from Ms. Bennett?" Rachel handed over a sealed letter. Grace had written it the night before. The judge read it silently. The room held its breath. "I have always feared dying without securing Hope's future," the letter said, "but now I don't. Because she has found her father, and I've seen how he looks at her, not with guilt or obligation, but with love, raw and new. Let her grow up knowing she was wanted. Let her stay with him." When the judge looked up, her voice was steady. "I need time to review this. In the meantime, Mr. Lane will continue to share custody with Ms. Bennett. Mr. Reeves, your petition is denied." They stepped into the hallway, a stunned hush around them. Christopher turned to Grace. "You didn't have to write that." "I know," she said, her eyes glistening. "But I wanted to." Before he could respond, a small voice echoed down the hallway. "Daddy!" Hope burst through the doors, her arms open wide, barreling into Christopher like a force of nature. He scooped her up instinctively, lifting her off the floor. "Daddy," she whispered again, clinging to him. His chest tightened at the sound. For the first time, the word didn't feel borrowed. It felt real. "Yes, baby," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. "I'm right here." Grace turned away, wiping a tear with the corner of her sleeve. Hope looked up, beaming. "Can we go to the library now? You promised to help me find the book with the girl who paints stars." Christopher laughed. I did promise, didn't I? Let's go find her. They walked down the corridor, his hand in hers and Grace slowly following behind them, her steps slower, but her heart lighter than it had been in months. From the corner, Eric watched, defeated and distant. He said nothing, because nothing he could say would compete with the truth in that child's smile. That night, as Christopher read Hope a bedtime story in his now child-proofed guest room, he paused mid-sentence. She'd fallen asleep with her head on his chest, a picture book still open in her lap. He didn't move. He just sat there in the stillness, listening to the soft rhythm of her breath, the rise and fall of her small chest. And for the first time in 9 long years, Christopher Lane felt whole. The days that followed were quiet but full of whispered bedtime stories, Saturday pancakes that came out a little too crispy, and early morning walks where Hope skipped alongside Christopher, narrating elaborate dreams about purple lions and strawberry-scented clouds. Christopher had never moved so slowly through life, and yet never so deliberately. Everything felt purposeful now. Grace's condition, however, was a shadow that stretched farther each day. "You look tired," Christopher said gently one afternoon, setting a glass of tea beside her on the couch. Grace chuckled weakly. "I look like someone whose liver is losing the war." "Don't joke about that," he said, sitting beside her. She looked at him, really looked, and her voice turned soft. "You need to be ready. I can't hold off forever, and Hope's going to need more than someone who visits." Christopher clenched his jaw, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I want her here, with me. Not because I owe you or Lydia, but because I can't imagine waking up and not hearing her voice in the morning." Grace smiled faintly. "Then we're already on the same page." The next morning, Grace didn't come out of her room. Hope stood in the hallway in her bunny slippers, clutching a drawing she'd made for her mom. "She always comes out when she hears the kettle whistle," she said quietly. Christopher knocked gently, then opened the door. Grace lay curled beneath the quilt, her skin pale, her breath slow but even. He stepped inside, worry pulsing beneath his ribs. Her eyes fluttered open. "I'm still here," she rasped, offering a weak smile. "Just not all the way." "I'm calling the doctor," he said, already reaching for his phone. She shook her head. "No, hospitals, not unless it's the end." "Grace, I mean it," she interrupted, her voice a thread of its former strength. "I don't want to waste what time I have under fluorescent lights. I want to be home, with Hope, with you." Christopher's hand dropped to his side. He sat on the edge of the bed, gripping her hand, heart aching. "You're not alone," he said quietly. She nodded, blinking back tears. "I know, and that's what makes this easier." The following week passed in a surreal rhythm. Nurses visited daily, quietly helping Grace with pain management, explaining what to expect, preparing both her and Christopher for the inevitable. Christopher hated every moment of it, hated how normal death could look when it came slowly. But he bore it all because she needed him to. One afternoon, Hope climbed into his lap as they sat by the window. "Is Mom going to get better?" she asked. Christopher's breath caught. He looked into her eyes, so much like Lydia's, and knew he couldn't lie. "She might not, sweetheart," he answered gently. "But she's going to be surrounded by love. Every second." Hope looked down at her hands. "Will she remember me if she goes?" He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Always. Just like you'll remember her." Hope nodded, quiet for a long while. Then she whispered, "Can I draw her something? So she won't forget." "You can draw her anything you want," he said, his throat thick. That night, Christopher found Grace awake, propped up in bed, staring at the ceiling. "I used to think dying would feel like fading," she murmured. But it doesn't. It feels like handing over something sacred, like passing a torch. Christopher sat beside her. Then let me hold it. Grace turned to him, her eyes wet. I'm not afraid to go, but I am afraid of what happens after. I don't want her lost. She won't be, he said softly. I swear to you. Hope will grow up with stories of her mom. She'll laugh, she'll chase sunflowers, and she'll know she's loved. Grace exhaled slowly, relief softening her features. Then I can rest. She reached to her nightstand and handed him a sealed envelope. When the time comes, it's for Court, for you, for Hope. He took it, hands trembling. Promise me, she whispered. Don't just give her your name. Give her your time, your whole heart. He leaned forward, tears finally falling. I already have. 3 nights later, as snow began to dust the streets of Denver, Grace passed away quietly in her sleep. Christopher found her in the morning, peaceful, her hand still resting over a folded drawing, Hope's latest gift, a picture of the 3 of them holding hands under a bright yellow sun, with the words, My family, scrawled in crayon. He didn't cry right away. He simply sat beside her and whispered, Thank you for everything. Later that afternoon, he held Hope close on the couch. She's gone, isn't she? Hope asked, her voice cracking. Christopher nodded, barely able to speak. Yes, baby, but she's still with us. Hope clung to him, sobbing into his chest. And as the light faded from the sky, Christopher knew the next chapter of their story had already begun. A chapter he would not let go of. Not now, not ever. The chapel was modest, just a quiet, sun-drenched space on the edge of Denver, surrounded by wind-blown trees and the faint scent of juniper. Grace never wanted a grand goodbye, only something simple, heartfelt, and honest, and that's exactly what Christopher gave her. Hope stood beside him in a navy blue dress that swallowed her small frame, her hand gripping his tightly. She didn't cry during the service, not once, but her silence screamed through the stillness of the room. Christopher spoke when no one else could. She loved fiercely, he said, voice steady despite the tremble underneath, and she gave everything she had to protect the people she loved, including me, including Hope. She raised a little girl who knows how to find joy in the smallest things, because Grace taught her to. That's the kind of legacy most of us only dream of leaving behind. He looked down at Hope, who blinked up at him with tearless eyes. She made both of us better. After the burial, Hope tucked a daisy into the edge of her mother's headstone. She liked wildflowers, she whispered, not roses. Wildflowers are free. Back at the apartment, the emptiness hit like a punch to the chest. The framed photo of Lydia and Grace on the mantel, the tea mug with Grace's lipstick still faintly stained on the rim, the worn cardigan draped over the arm of the sofa, it all screamed of a presence that had just vanished. Christopher moved carefully through each room, unsure of what to pack, what to keep, what to say to Hope. Eventually, he settled on sitting beside her on the floor where she had begun coloring in silence. She said you'd take care of me, Hope murmured, not looking up. I will, he replied quietly. Always. Even if someone says you can't? His brow furrowed. What do you mean? Hope shrugged. Her crayon paused mid-stroke. There was a man at the funeral. He stared at us the whole time. Afterward, he told me he was my uncle, Christopher's. Pulse quickened. Did he say anything else? Hope nodded. He said maybe I'd come live with him, but I don't want to. Christopher stood up, his voice gentle but resolute. You won't go anywhere you don't want to, okay? Okay, she said, her voice small. But the next day, the threat arrived in the form of a formal envelope, stamped, notarized, and direct. A petition for guardianship, filed by one Matthew Hartley, Grace's estranged cousin. The courtroom felt colder than the snow-covered streets outside. Christopher sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped tightly. Across from him, Hartley wore a dark gray suit and a smug expression that made Christopher's jaw clench. "My client," Hartley's attorney began smoothly, "believes that in the wake of Grace Carter's untimely death, it is in the child's best interest to be placed with blood relatives, those who can provide both stability and a connection to her maternal lineage." The judge nodded, expression unreadable. "Mr. Lane," she said, turning to Christopher, "do you have legal documentation asserting parental rights?" Christopher stood. "Your Honor, I have a letter written by Grace Carter before her death. In it, she clearly names me as Hope's biological father and expresses her wish that I continue to raise her." The judge gestured. "Let me see the document." He handed it over with trembling hands. The courtroom fell into silence as the judge read. Then she looked up, her gaze softened, but still firm. "Is there DNA evidence to support this?" Christopher inhaled slowly. "Not yet. Grace passed before we could complete testing, but I am willing to submit myself and Hope for a paternity test." Hartley's lawyer interjected. "Your Honor, we have grave concerns over Mr. Lane's sudden reappearance in the child's life. He had no involvement during her early years." Christopher's voice rose with quiet conviction. "I didn't know she existed. I would have given anything to have been there, but now that I do know, there's nothing more important to me than being in her life." He paused, then added, "Hope calls me Dad. She draws pictures of us as a family, and the night Grace died, she asked if she could still stay with me. That should matter." The judge nodded slowly. "We'll reconvene after the paternity results are in. Until then, temporary guardianship will remain with Mr. Lane." Hartley's expression soured, but Christopher didn't care. All that mattered was the small hand that slipped into his as they walked out of the courtroom together. That evening, Hope climbed into Christopher's bed, her bed now, in his house, and curled up beside him without a word. Her quiet presence said everything. This was home. He was home. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside, something warm had begun to take root. He pulled the quilt up over her shoulder and whispered, "You're safe, I promise." Her sleepy voice answered, "I know, Daddy." The word pierced his heart, not with pain this time, but with something far deeper. Love, responsibility, and hope. The morning sun filtered gently through gauzy curtains, casting warm lines across the floor of the breakfast nook. Christopher sat across from Hope at the small table, watching her carefully write her name on a worksheet. Her brow furrowed in concentration, tongue poking slightly out of the corner of her mouth. He sipped his coffee and smiled softly. She was settling in, slowly, cautiously, but noticeably. The silence between them no longer felt strained. It felt like understanding. But beneath the domestic calm, a storm continued to gather. The court had granted temporary guardianship, but the final decision still hinged on the paternity test. The results were expected any day now, and Matthew Hartley had made it clear he wasn't giving up without a fight. That afternoon, Christopher's lawyer, Miriam, arrived with a solemn look and a manila folder under her arm. "We have the results," she said, wasting no time. Hope looked up from her drawing, curious. Christopher took the envelope and opened it slowly, carefully, like it might contain something that could shatter him. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear. Then, confirmation. In bold, clinical language, probability of paternity, 99.997%. He exhaled, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. Miriam placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're her father, legally and biologically." Hope blinked at him. "What's that mean?" Christopher crouched beside her chair, eyes misty. "It means I'm really, truly your dad." She tilted her head. "Even if that paper said you weren't, you still feel like my dad?" He couldn't stop the tears then. And you've always felt like my daughter. 2 days later, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. The paternity test had altered the dynamics of the case, but Hartley's attorney wasn't backing down. Even with paternity established, the man argued, Mr. Lane is a recent presence in this child's life. He lacks the emotional history and practical experience needed to raise her. My client, on the other hand, has extended family, a large home, and a stable domestic environment. Christopher remained seated, hands folded tightly in his lap, but inside he burned. When called to the stand, he spoke plainly. I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers. I'm not going to stand here and say I know how to French braid or make perfect grilled cheese, he said, prompting a small smile from Hope, who sat quietly behind him. But I know her bedtime routine. I know she likes to draw hearts in the margins of her homework. I know she's brave when she's sad and funny when she's nervous. I know she hums when she brushes her teeth. He paused. I didn't get to be there when she was born. I didn't hold her when she took her first steps, but I'm here now, and I will never walk away. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. Is there any further evidence you wish to submit, Mr. Lane? Christopher nodded. Yes, Your Honor. A letter. From Hope's aunt, Grace Carter. He stepped forward and handed over the envelope. Inside was the note Grace had written before she died, her shaky handwriting a poignant testament of trust. The judge read it silently. When she looked up, her expression had softened. This court finds sufficient grounds to grant full and permanent custody of Hope Lydia Carter to Christopher Lane, her biological father. There was a collective exhale from the courtroom, some in relief, others in reluctant defeat. Hartley stood, visibly stunned. Hope turned toward Christopher, unsure. He opened his arms. She ran into them. Later that night, after the news had spread, after the lawyer's handshake, the brief press inquiry and the congratulatory emails, Christopher and Hope sat side by side on the living room floor, surrounded by unopened boxes and half-eaten celebratory cupcakes. Hope leaned her head against his shoulder. Do you think Mom knows? He didn't have to ask who she meant. I do, he said softly. I think she's known all along. Hope reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing, her usual stick figures with bright smiles and bold labels. Me, Mom, and now, in fresh pink crayon, Dad. Christopher's voice caught. You put me in. You've always been in, she said simply. I just didn't draw you until now. He looked at the drawing for a long time, then whispered, Thank you. I think she'd be happy, Hope added. I think Grace would be too. Christopher looked at the girl beside him, so resilient, so kind, so quietly strong, and felt something shift deep inside. He wasn't just a man trying to do right anymore. He was a father, and this child wasn't his second chance. She was the very purpose of his life. A soft drizzle tapped against the windows of the sunlit room, its rhythm soothing as it washed over the quiet Denver morning. Christopher stood in the kitchen, carefully measuring flour and sugar, his movements slow but purposeful. The countertop was cluttered with open recipe books, lemon halves, and a mixing bowl stained with yellow zest. Hope likes it extra sweet, he murmured, smiling at the thought as he adjusted the sugar. From the hallway, the sound of bare feet padded toward him, light and playful. Smells like sunshine, Hope said brightly, peeking into the kitchen with sleepy eyes and bedhead curls that shot off in every direction. She wore her favorite lemon print pajamas, now slightly too small for her growing frame. Christopher turned and chuckled. Well, Sunshine's favorite lemonade is almost ready. Today's the grand opening, remember? She said, suddenly serious as she stepped into her role of miniature CEO. You promised we'd do it together. I haven't forgotten, he said warmly. The signs are already up, and I ironed my apron. She beamed. Did you practice the pour? You always spill. He feigned offense. Hey, I only spilled twice last time. 3, she corrected, holding up 3 fingers and giggling. Christopher placed a hand over his heart dramatically. Harsh. Very harsh, Miss Carter. Miss Lane, she said, her voice quiet but certain. He turned fully toward her. Yeah? I want to change my name, she said softly, stepping forward until she stood before him. I want to be Elaine, like you. Christopher's throat tightened. You sure? She nodded. It feels right. He dropped to one knee, leveling with her. Then it's done. You're Hope Lane. She hugged him tightly, fiercely. Thank you for finding me. You found me too, sweetheart, he whispered against her hair. Maybe you more than I found you. Outside, beneath a white canopy tent and a modest hand-painted banner that read, Hope's Lemonade and Love, the new lemonade stand buzzed with early foot traffic. Neighbors, local reporters, even some employees from Christopher's Organic Food Company gathered in support. The lemonade was tart, sweet, and exactly the way Hope liked it. She poured with care, handed out cups with practiced flair, and greeted every customer with a confident, Welcome to Hope's. Christopher stood behind her, wiping spills and handing her change with a proud smile that never faded. Margot, his longtime assistant, stopped by with her daughter. CEO to CEO, she said, nodding at Hope. I think you've got competition, Mr. Lane. He smiled. I'm counting on it. Hope leaned over. Dad, can I tell people about the foundation? He blinked. You sure? She nodded. I want them to know. So he stepped to the side, let her stand on the little step stool they'd painted lemon yellow, and watched as she cleared her throat. Hi, everyone, she called. The crowd hushed. My name is Hope Lane, and this is my lemonade stand. But it's also something more. My dad and I are starting the Hope Foundation. It's going to help kids like me, kids who maybe didn't have their parents at first but still have big dreams. We're going to help them believe in miracles. Silence. Then a wave of applause that felt like sunlight breaking through the rain. Christopher wiped a tear from his cheek before anyone could see. That evening, after the tent was packed away and the last lemon was squeezed, Christopher and Hope sat on the front porch, wrapped in a blanket. Hope rested her head on his shoulder. Mom would have liked today. I think she was watching, he said gently. Hope looked up at the sky, then down at her drawing pad. Can I draw something for her? Of course. She sketched quickly, simple lines and bold colors. A small girl with a big smile, standing between a tall man and a woman with long curly hair. Above them, a bright yellow sun and a giant heart. Christopher leaned in. That's us? She nodded. And Mom, I wanted her in the picture too. His voice broke a little. It's beautiful. I'm going to put it on the fridge, she said proudly, with the other ones. Hope hopped off the porch to run inside. Just before she disappeared through the door, she paused and turned back. Dad? Yeah, honey? Can I add a rainbow too? He smiled. Add whatever you want. She'd love that. As the door closed, Christopher remained seated, gazing out at the dusk-washed sky. A soft breeze carried the scent of lemons and late spring. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Not because of the empire he'd built, not because of the money, the company, or the respect he commanded, but because of the little girl who had taught him what it meant to begin again. Tomorrow, there would be more drawings, more lemonade, more mornings with bedhead curls and sleepy giggles, and he would be there for all of it. Because love, when finally found, is not something you walk away from. It's something you build, day by precious day. And, together, they would build a life where hope was not just her name. It was their legacy.